My name is Julie Madden, and I am so happy to welcome you this morning wherever you are on your journey, and to welcome our guest speaker, Fionnuala Ni Aolian. Fionnuala is a professor at the University of Minnesota Law School and director of the Human Rights Center there, as well as a professor at the Queen's University in Belfast and the Special Rapporteur at the United Nations on the promotion and protection of human rights while countering terrorism. She also, I learned, has a 20-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 16-year-old. So her conflict management skills are practiced everywhere in the world. Catholic social teaching says that all people have a right to life and a right to what is needed to live in dignity. It is vital this week that we remind ourselves of this as we anguish over the invasion of Ukraine, as we will gather virtually with members of our sister parish a week from next week to commemorate International Women's Day and lift up the rights of women, and as we are reminded by today's gospel that we are responsible for what we do as a nation, a church, as members of the human family, to protect the dignity of our brothers and sisters. And we are blessed to have a global leader in human rights with us this morning. Please welcome Fionnuala Ni Aolian.
Good morning, everyone. I should say I'm a tired global leader. My two teenage Minnesotans were out for their first midwinter dance in 2 years, so I had a late night watching them come in late last night. But with that, I want to thank you for your invitation to have me join you this morning. And I hope in this time to speak to you about rights and justice, war and peace. We are in the eye of the storm, and that storm sits over the Ukraine. Ukraine is under assault. The images of huddled masses sitting under hangovers of cars, sitting in the underground train stations, hundreds and thousands of people anxiously trying to cross the borders into neighboring countries. All of this is resonant imagery of another time and another war and another aggression in Europe. For me, one of the most compelling images of the last 3 to 4 days was BBC footage. I think it was the first day of the assault in Kiev, when it was an image of a neonatal unit being emptied out, nurses trying to get small babies, some of them only hours old, safely to the basement of the hospital with ventilators and oxygen equipment and these tiny, tiny babies in hand. And as a mother, as fathers in the audience too, all of you, we can only imagine the kinds of horror that people woke up to in that day. It is true that Ukraine is under assault, but something far more pronounced is under assault. The global order that we built after the Second World War, in the ashes of the Second World War, a global order premised on the United Nations Charter, which was intended to do a number of things to protect human rights and human dignity in the aftermath of a Holocaust that murdered 6 million Jews and many others. But it was intended to be a collective security system that would stop this kind of assault. Imperfect. These kinds of documents are always imperfect. They're compromises, they're structures that are not, that essentially depend on the goodwill of those who commit to signing and implementing them. And so they're fragile, and I think one of the things we are realizing in the last week and in the last couple of days is how entirely fragile they are. And so it's that global international order that was constructed after the Second World War, which is also in the eye of the storm. also under assault in Ukraine. And with it, our international institutions are under assault. Because the very idea that you can march across your neighbor's border and simply assault them with the grandiose claim of sovereignty over another place undercuts all of these fragile compromises that were made at the end of the Second World War, which have held, albeit imperfectly, in the last 50 plus years. And many of us who work in the UN system find ourselves at a moment where we look at the degree of comfort that the new authoritarians take in the United Nations, in other multilateral spaces. They who care little, it appears, for a rules-based international order. They who care little for the human rights and human dignities, not only of their own people, as has been evidenced by the 1,700 or so Russians who have been arrested in the last couple of days protesting, but they care little for these fragile bargains that have kept us mostly safe over the past decades. And so we are in the eye of the storm. Before I come back to the storm, I want to talk a little bit about my own life and my trajectory to doing human rights and international law work here in Minnesota and beyond. I was born in the west of Ireland, but have spent much of my adult life in Belfast, Northern Ireland. I went to law school in 1987, in the height of the conflict. Those of you who remember Northern Ireland from the front pages of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s will recall a conflict that was taking place in a democracy, a Western democracy. And in some ways, it's actually an oxymoron. Democracies are supposed to be self-correcting. They're not supposed to produce the conditions that enable and sustain violence and systematic violations of human rights over many decades. But that was the reality in Northern Ireland. The place I grew up in was a place where if you were Catholic, you were not likely to be a judge. You were definitely not going to be in the police force. You would experience a life in which your life as a citizen had less value and less status than that of your Protestant neighbor. And so when I went to law school in 1987, I and my fellow students were also in the eye of the storm. That storm included the systematic use of violence by non-state actors. Long list from the IRA to the UVF to the INLA. We could be here all morning if we went through the list of acronyms. But these were groups who targeted civilians directly. The civilian was the target. And so as a young law student, I would wake up in the morning and have to decide which route I would take to law school, so you'd figure out what bridge to avoid, what road had been blown up, where there was violence on that particular day. It was also a period of time in which the state used torture systematically against persons who had been arrested and imprisoned. It was a time where gerrymandering, a word that emerged in Ireland, was rifely practiced. It meant that you did not have a fair shot at being an equal and fair part of the society you were brought up in. 2 weeks after I landed at law school, I had gone to Belfast because, for obvious reasons, if you have a conflict, that's often where you find the people fighting for rights. And they're usually a small but brave community. And so I joined a small organization called the Committee on the Administration of Justice, a long, very neutral name that was trying to signal that they were on the side of rights. Because one of the hard things in Northern Ireland at that time was to speak about rights was to take a side. It looked like you were on one side or other of the conflict, not actually making a claim that everyone who lived in that society had an equal right to be treated equally and with dignity. And so I spent much of my law school days trying to get through law school, but also trying to work in a place where there was a very, to use the poet John Hewitt's phrase, a very narrow ground for rights. And one of my indelible memories as a law student, most law students don't have a lot of skills, and I say to my own students, do what you can where you are. Stand where you are, look around you, see what needs to be done and do it. And so I remember as a law student being called by a family to observe an inquest, a witness, a post-mortem that was connected to an inquest. A family member had just been killed, and they needed someone in the room to observe. I was not an expert in any of those things, but what I could do was observe. What I could do was witness. And so from the family's point of view, having someone else in the room simply watching what the others were doing meant that they would take greater care. They might be warned that they needed to be fair and that there was some other set of eyes on what was being done. And so that work in Belfast lasted through much of my law school career, then onwards to being a young law professor trying to get tenure. And we came to a point in Northern Ireland in 1998 where we signed a peace agreement, the Good Friday Peace Agreement. And I think it's really important to say that, you know, in many ways, if you're working in the darkness of human rights violations and a lack of justice, the light is always the least before the dawn. Things look the darkest before they change. And many of us were unprepared for the change, even though we'd been working for it for a really long time. So there's a couple of things I learned from the Good Friday Peace Agreement and being a part of that process as a lawyer. One thing I learned is that the deal, just like the United Nations Charter, is never perfect. We don't get perfect deals. If we got perfect deals, we'd be talking to ourselves, you know? And the deal is imperfect because it has to be. It's always a little bit like Barack Obama's words on the US Constitution or project. It's an imperfect union moving towards something better. But accepting compromise is at the heart of making peace. And the second thing that follows from that is you accept compromise with people who've really hurt you. You accept compromise with all of the actors who were at the table, included all those non-state actors, two governments, and the United States helping them make a deal. And it means that you have to make a deal with people who've deeply harmed you and who themselves have been deeply harmed by the process of the harm they have done. And many of us have forgotten how to make those kinds of deals because they're deeply painful and they're imperfect because they require us to give up some perfections in order to get the deal. And the third thing we learned from that peace agreement is that it takes a long, long time to make peace. You can sign a piece of paper. That doesn't make peace. It takes years and years of work to do that. And so almost 2 decades later, over 2 decades later, I find myself as United Nations Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights, a position that was born out of the horrors of torture and rendition that the United States put in place after the events of 9/11. And that legacy still sits with us today as 39 men, many of whom have never been charged with a single crime, remain incarcerated in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and are likely to die there. Aging, ill, tortured men who have never seen the light of day of a courtroom. And so let me close by reading a psalm, Psalm 120, which says, "I am peace, but when I speak, they are for war." And Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who lived in what is now Ukraine, a famous Jewish scholar, and whose grave is a site of pilgrimage for many Jews, teaches us that the psalmist is unable to speak peace even though he or she is fully identified with peace. So war is not only belligerence of an adversary, but it's the breakdown of the power of speech itself. All speech is peace, and words of war are actually not words at all, but they're themselves, they are weapons, as we've seen this past week. They are means of violence. In the middle of this war, there are no words at all, only the shells of words, hollowed out. And so maybe what we're left with is prayer. And so let me close with a prayer. May the shelter of peace be made possible by the silencing of the noise of war and the return to words that carry and are carried by peace. Thank you.